Do you know where your shirt was made? How about your watch? I did a little bit of Googling today and I found out that my watch is probably made in China or Taiwan. I'm not sure which. So the question is, do consumers care where their stuff is made? And manufacturers and retailers, do they have an incentive to make things in the USA? So today, that's what we're talking about. It's the whys and hows of offshoring and reshoring. This is Where We Buy. It's the show where we talk to retail experts and we visit the places where we buy. My name is James Cook. I research retail and real estate for JLL. And this week, we're recording live in front of a global internet audience. We're on LinkedIn Live, we're on YouTube, we're on Periscope, we're all over the place. As we're going along, if you are a live viewer and you have a question or comment, feel free to type it into the chat and we're going to get to as many of your questions and comments as we can during the show. So today, we're going to be hearing from Harry Moser, who is a reshoring expert. We're going to be hearing from Rich Thompson, who is a supply chain logistics consultant. But before that, I wanted to talk to a retail expert, and that's why I invited Naveen Jaggi. Welcome, Naveen.
Hey, James, how are you?
Excellent. It's great to see you. Naveen leads the national retail brokerage for JLL, and he's also the chairman of the Global Retail Leasing Board, which gives him, I think, a unique perspective both on the mindset of the retailer and the mindset of the consumer. So Naveen, question right off the bat. Do you think that retailers care where the stuff that they sell is made? Is it important to them right now?
I think what retailers care most about is what their consumers care about. At the end of the day, their decisions are based by what the consumer wants. And if the consumer doesn't ultimately care where it comes from because they can get it at the price that they want to buy it at, that's what they're going to provide them. Look, we've been seeing the outshoring of U.S. product or retail goods since the 90s. And what that's resulted in is a more affordable, more value-oriented consumer landscape. And for the most part, the consumer hasn't pushed back and said they want stuff made in the USA. They may want something made in the USA, but the millions of things we sell day to day across the board, they haven't pushed back and said they want that particular thing made in the USA. So until the consumer speaks loud enough for the retailer to react, I don't think you're going to see a big change in the way where product is sourced from.
That's an interesting point, Naveen, and I think there's a contradiction there because I've seen survey data that says that they really care, but then you see how people vote with their money, and they don't seem to care as much. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, we love to talk about born in the USA and made in the USA, and we think it's great. And I think to our heartstrings, it always sounds really good. But ultimately, wallet talks. And if at the end of the day, I can save 50, 60, 70% by buying something made somewhere else, and I may not actually want to know where it came from because it may actually bother me if I knew where it came from. I'll continue to buy something if it's made from another part of the world, as long as I don't have to deal with the consequences of knowing what really came into that product. So you're right. I think we want to believe that we want things made in the USA, but actually we can't necessarily investigate where things come from. And it requires too much work. At the end of the day, we'll just defer to the fact that we want it at the cheapest price possible, and we'll get it at the cheapest price possible.
Yeah. So from a retailer's perspective, I feel like COVID's kind of messed up global supply chain networks. Has that made making stuff in the USA more appealing to retailers now?
Well, I think they've started to reassess their supply chain, if you will, right? What we know is that in the spring of 2020, at the height of the pandemic, roughly $2 trillion worth of orders were canceled. And that had an immense impact across the supply chain, from the sourcing of the product to the manufacturing of the product to the shipping of the product, ultimately to the distribution of that product back to your store. And so the idea now is, can we see some subtle shifting in the retail landscape of product coming from a quote unquote safer distance and a safer journey? I think it's something that many retailers are thinking, exploring, but the cost of having two suppliers, two supply chains, two manufacturers, or multiple manufacturers from different parts of the world is in itself a costly endeavor. And if that starts impacting margin, will the US consumer buy it then? So yeah, we like the idea, and retailers have certainly looked into it, but it's a massive re-engineering of your supply chain to take something from made in, say, East Asia and moving it to Mexico, Latin America, Europe, Central Europe. Those are massive shifts, seismic shifts that don't take place overnight. These are 5-10 year journeys. So don't look for something to happen immediately. But yes, I think retailers are far more thoughtful or are not being exposed to a massive supply chain disruption in the future.
Interesting. I'm sure other guests are going to have something to say about that as well. So I got one more question for you. Yeah. I know you said that a lot of shoppers, they don't really care that much about where their stuff's made, but I'm sure there's a segment out there that cares. And why do they care? Is it just purely, patriotism, or like what's the driving force behind that?
Well, I think you're starting to see a lot more people be sensitive to the idea that if it's made in the USA, it's good for the USA, right? And I think we're living in an era right now where a lot of people are really concerned about how the globe got too globalized. And if you see the political landscape today, a lot of that's being said that globalization hasn't been good for the American worker. Same thing that they've said in Europe with Great Britain and Brexit. It wasn't good for the British worker. So I think a lot of people now are asking the question, if I'm buying something, is it good for the US worker? So I think there is a sentiment there, and you'll see a certain part of the manufacturing world that will talk about the fact that products coming from the USA, made in the USA. But as I know, James, made in the USA may mean assembled in the USA, but made somewhere else, right, James? So now we start getting into the vernacular of what really defines made in the USA. And so I would say that for the short term, I think people care. It will make a difference in the way people think about product, but it won't necessarily change the mass consumer mindset about ultimately where the product comes from until enough people say so.
Yeah, absolutely. And that got me thinking about my phone that says proudly designed in the USA. Of course, it's manufactured probably in China.
Okay. That's right. Yeah, we know it is.
All right. Well, Naveen, we're going to say goodbye to you for a little bit. We're going to be coming back later to see Naveen again during our group discussion. But right now, we're going to talk to Harry Moser. Welcome, Harry. How are you doing today?
Great, James. Good to be here.
So Harry is the founder and president of the nonprofit Reshoring Initiative. So the perfect person to talk to on this topic. He also serves on the U.S. Commerce Department's Investment Advisory Council. So Harry, question for you about context. A little bit of what's the short version of the history of why did manufacturing leave the U.S. in the first place?
Exactly what Naveen suggested, price. Starting 50, 60 years ago with Japan, going through a series of countries, clearly the U.S. is not price competitive. And on average, we're 10 to 20% higher manufacturing costs than Europe and 40% higher than China. And so when companies look at that, the consumer demands low price, companies searches around, they go where they can get it. And it isn't just a problem with China. We have a trade deficit with 9 of our top 10 trading partners, everybody except the UK, which is past its industrial peak, so to speak. And so we're just not competitive. There's in terms of how we got there, the government lacks an industrial policy. Every other country pretty much has an industrial policy. How do I bring good manufacturing jobs here? US has, I'd say, a deindustrial policy. We let the dollar go up 300% in the last 40 years. We have a poor basic education. We have horrible recruiting and training for skilled workforce. Corporate tax rates were too high for too long. Don't have a value-added tax that would tax the product coming in. No concern about the trade deficit. Economists say it doesn't matter. And so we have our prices are too high and we have a trade deficit, and most of the things at the retail come from somewhere else.
So it sounds like a lot of arguments for offshoring. What are the arguments for reshoring then?
Oh, first, from the country's viewpoint, which Naveen alluded to a bit, self-sufficiency. So during the COVID crisis, we saw what happened when we were not self-sufficient, anywhere near self-sufficient in masks and gowns and gloves and everything else. And everybody now understands the same thing for rare earth minerals, 5G, electric vehicle batteries, et cetera. So self-sufficiency, economic growth, manufacturing has the best multiplier effect. Income equality. Everybody complains about lack of income equality, but much of that Gini coefficient came from the hollowing out of the manufacturing middle class. A little bit from the billionaires, but it's more from the millions, the 5 million jobs we lost in the middle class. The environment, you make it here instead of making it there and shipping it here, maybe 25, 50% less CO2 impact. R&D, our product development works best when engineering and manufacturing are right next to each other and can communicate. Balancing the budget deficit. If we bring back those 5 million manufacturing jobs and their companies expand, everybody will be paying taxes. They won't be getting welfare. Budget deficit comes down. So, and eventually, if the U.S. continues to have its trade deficit and budget deficit, eventually we lose our reserve currency status, the dollar collapses, interest rates go way up, the U.S. goes bankrupt, and that's not good. So I'd much rather reshore.
Well, yeah, I'm in favor of not having any of that. So here's a question I've got for you. I read that companies should make their sourcing decisions based on the total cost of ownership. What does that mean? How do you calculate something like that?
Okay, so total cost of ownership starts with the FOB or ex-works price, the price at the factory door here and there, and then it adds in everything else, what we call the hidden costs, the ones that most companies ignore, the duty and the freight and the carrying cost of inventory, every risk you can think of, intellectual property, risk of stocking out, big problem in retail, markdowns can be like 40% of product marked down 40% kind of thing, can be horrible. Emergency air freight when you can't get it here in time because you didn't predict well enough. Pandemics, a small risk, but a real risk of China decoupling. I know China experts that say China may get so mad because of Trump, because of Taiwan, because of tariffs, that they'll not allow their companies to ship to the U.S. Imagine what that would do for reshoring. There'd be a lot of it happening really fast. The value of a made in USA label. It's in some products it has a 5 or 10% premium. So we have a free online product called the Total Cost of Ownership Estimator, and looking at companies who've used that and done the calculation, about 20% of what is too high priced in the US to source here is lower in TCO. So when they shift from price to TCO and making their decision, about 20 or 30% of the work makes sense to bring back.
That's interesting. I want to ask for a little color on one thing that you mentioned. You said some things have a 5 or 10% premium when they have that made in the USA label. What is it? What category of products do you see that happening in?
It can be more. Some people say they'll pay 20, 30% more. Typically, it's products that you might think of as dangerous if things go bad. So anything for the baby, where something could fall off. Something for the pets. There were some problems with pet something or others that went wrong sometime in the past. So anything that involves risk, there's people are likely to head towards the U.S., maybe German, maybe Swiss, maybe Japanese, but preferring not, for example, to buy Chinese. So there's also some preferences. Traditionally, the mature citizen cared more about made in USA than the younger people. But now the younger people have picked up on ESG, social responsibility, the environment, the problems with the Muslims, I think, in China, et cetera, and they say that's all horrible. Well, okay, well, buy American, So one thing we do is try to make that ESG appeal to the citizens to get them to start thinking about the country.
Gotcha. Understood. So for listeners out there who are at a company, maybe they've got some offshore manufacturing going on, or they're selling things that are made in other countries and they're selling them in the US, what advice would you give to them as far as investigating reshoring?
Okay, so I broke it down into a couple of categories. Real estate investors, I think we have some of those out there. We have something called the Supply Chain Gap Program that would let you find interesting products that are being imported in large quantity and nobody's making them in the country that might fill some of those buildings. You might be able to get the foreign supplier to come in and do FDI here. We can help you with that. Convert excess retail space into industrial space near populations that would need a job. For retailers, use total cost in making your decisions. Consider the benefits of lower inventory, less stockouts, less markdowns. Really important, I think, make it easy to find U.S. products. Consumers say they want to buy made in USA, but they don't do it too often. But when you go into most stores and you ask, show me some of this stuff made in the United States, they raise their hands and say, almost nothing, look at the label, maybe you can find it, kind of thing, right? So if the store does and the brand, if they do a really good job of marking and identifying and helping you locate the made in USA products, then people are going to do it more. Clearly, they'll do it more. I'm the reshoring guy, and I give up sometimes. I can't find it. For manufacturers, using total cost. Reshore when it makes sense, doesn't always make sense. Do it when it makes sense. We say, again, 20, 30% makes sense to come back. Look at your products that you're importing. Look at the ones that are causing you pain. Long deliveries, quality issues, intellectual property issues, too much inventory, something like that. Those are the ones that you can deal with. Invest in automation, lean skills to close any remaining gaps. So we think 20, 30% makes sense. It's a question of doing the math and finding those things.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to say goodbye to Harry for a few minutes. And we'll say hello again to Harry when we get back to our group discussion. But now I want to turn to Rich Thompson. Welcome, Rich. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks, James. I'm doing great.
Awesome. So Rich leads our supply chain and logistics solution team at JLL. He's got over 25 years of experience in supply chain and logistics. So the perfect person to bring in for this topic. So Rich, I want to start a little big picture. I know you work with a lot of large corporate occupiers, and you've worked with these clients through COVID. So what are the trends that you're seeing now that we're coming out of COVID?
Well, I would tell you, based on the work that we're doing with big corporate occupiers, as well as, my network of contacts and all the information that I get that's flowing in, there's kind of four big things that are happening in supply chain today for our corporate occupier clients. One is risk management. Harry hit on that a little bit earlier, but, companies are looking to diversify away from one source of supply if they can at all today. So it's, the pandemic, it put a big spotlight on the fragile nature of global supply chains, but also the concerns about China. And so I think less about China and just more about having more than one source of supply. And so that's critically important. Risk management, that takes on a lot of other implications as well. The second thing is e-commerce, and this is the obvious one, but the pandemic clearly accelerated the growth of e-commerce and the adoption rates. So for those people that might not have done online grocery or even, direct to home delivery via e-commerce, a lot of them tried it, liked it, and are continuing to use it. The good news is there's still a lot of runway left for growth in the United States and around the world of e-commerce. It's still a small percentage of total retail sales. But for those companies that had a channel, ability to deliver direct to homes during the pandemic, they did extremely well. But for the companies that did not, they really were hurting. And so it has all companies looking at their direct to consumer channels today, and that's really going to be important. And online grocery was the biggest beneficiary, and we're going to see more and more of that. The third thing is supply chain network redesign, and this is what we do a lot of within the JLL supply chain consulting team, is help our clients think about their network. It could be a distribution network. How many, where should they be and why, distribution centers, or it could be manufacturing. Do I make it in China? Do I make it in Mexico? Do I make it in the United States? Or it could be both. And, there was a study done recently of CFOs, and they said that the vast majority expected that they would have major changes to their networks within the next 18 months. And we're seeing a lot of that demand. We couldn't be busier from a supply chain network strategy consulting perspective. And then the last thing I would say, the post-pandemic issues are still around labor, and that's attracting and retaining quality labor. And for many years, that was not an issue in supply chain because you'd have a 500,000 square foot distribution center and you might employ 150 people that would move pallets around. But today, if you're in the fulfillment business, direct to consumer business, that 500,000 square foot warehouse might employ 3 to 10 times as many in seasonal peaks. And so finding the labor to pick and pack and do the kinds of things you need to do today requires an incredibly skilled workforce. It's just hard to find, even though the pandemic, drove unemployment rates up. That's one of the number one challenges for corporate supply chain practitioners today.
Gotcha. I read you had written a piece, sort of a point of view piece on this topic recently that's actually posted on our JLL website. And one of the things that popped out to me is you wrote the demand for manufacturing related facilities has soared 93% year over year. So, I mean, that's huge demand. How does that play out? I mean, it's got to be tough to fulfill that kind of demand.
Yeah, it really is. It's very interesting to me. I noticed it in our consulting work where, typically the vast majority of our work is focused on distribution centers and distribution center networks. And that might be obvious because there's a lot more distribution centers than there are manufacturing facilities. But it would be, call it 90+% of the time it would be focused on distribution. So 9 out of 10. And then one on maybe a manufacturing site selection project. That could be, pure manufacturing, it could be assembly, but, that type of operation. And what we've been seeing is a shift to maybe 60% distribution, 40% manufacturing. I mean, a real steady increase. The numbers that you just stated were actually from JLL Industrial Research. So it wasn't just some assumption on my part, but it was our research team and based on a lot of proprietary and other public data that suggests that the demand for manufacturing related, which could be assembly as well, has soared 93% year over year. That's you can't argue with those numbers, but it's absolutely amazing. But I'm not surprised to see that.
Yeah, that is huge. So one thing also that I noticed is, so I quoted you from a paper that you recently wrote. You wrote a very similar paper about 10 years ago where you're making an argument for this reshoring. How much in that 10-year period since 2011 have you seen a progression happen? Is it more prevalent now?
Well, as Harry stated earlier, this isn't for every industry, for every product, for every company, the idea of reshoring. I think Harry mentioned, 20 to 30% of maybe, industry segments are kind of ripe to reevaluate or look at their networks and are probably in a spot where they could do this and make it work. But it's not for everybody. But what we're seeing here 10 years later, and you're right, we wrote a position paper on this in 2011. And there's a couple of key elements here that companies are focused on from a supply chain perspective. And it's the big cost buckets. Harry and Naveen both mentioned, it all comes down to price. And a lot of it does come down to price. We all know that. But freight costs are one of the biggest operating costs that any company has. And the longer the distance that you're sending products, the more it costs. And freight costs are going up. That's a fact. Labor costs, which drove a lot of the outsourcing of manufacturing to China initially, have gone way up in China. And as Harry mentioned, automation and robotics have gotten better and better, and the cost of those things have come down. So there's an offset there that makes it more and more attractive for companies to look at the U.S. again for manufacturing. Risk and complexity is another huge issue that I think companies didn't focus on as much as they do now, because when you see what's happened with the pandemic, if you see what's happened with tsunamis in Japan, in the past, or flooding in Thailand that have had a big impact on, manufacturing operations, those things just come into play. The spotlight gets put on them, and they're real, and they're going to continue to happen. Okay. So, but the real change in my mind in 10 years is the customer service requirements, the need for speed. Okay. 10 years ago, if you ordered something online or, over the phone and it came to you within 5 to 7 days, you were perfectly happy. And Amazon in large part, and the Amazon effect, as people would call it, have ingrained in people that if you order something, you're going to get it in 2 days and for free. And the expectation now for consumers is only going to get more intense. People are looking at getting it next day, same day, within a few hours, as I suspect the grocery industry will go to. And so that need for speed is real. And when you're trying to, manufacture or source products from all over the world from long distances, it makes it a lot harder. So sourcing or manufacturing closer to the final consumer provides you, the ability to be much more nimble and get there faster. And I think that's the biggest change over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's a great point about the changing consumer. Well, let's bring back Naveen and Harry, and let's do a bit of a group discussion here. I want to tell all of our viewers out there, if you're on LinkedIn Live, if you're on YouTube, type in a question or comment in the chat, and we'll be happy to address it, time willing. Let's start out. Well, here's something that I actually, before we get into other questions, I had one more question about automation. So it seems to me that the factory of the future is going to be more and more highly automated. So if we bring manufacturing back to the US, can have a lot more robots in that factory. Does that mean we don't get many new US jobs as a benefit?
I guess that's one for me. Because we compete on all goods, all of them are almost all are tradable. The more competitive we are, the more automated we are, the more we'll reshore, the more we'll make. And just balancing the trade deficit, imports equals exports, increases U.S. manufacturing by 40%. So we can increase productivity by 2-3% a year in excess of what we're doing now for 20 years. And just bring back that work that we've lost. And by doing the automation, we'll become competitive enough to bring it back. So we say that if we will lose more jobs to Chinese automation if we do not automate than we will to U.S. automation if we do. So get going, automate.
Well, and if I could add to that, James, you mentioned manufacturing and automating manufacturing, but it's also on the distribution side. that we're seeing robotics and automation take a real hold. Amazon bought Kiva Robotics, back a number of years ago, and they were one of the first to employ that from a distribution standpoint. We're going to see more and more and more of that. And, when the manufacturing comes back, it has a trickle-down effect on the rest of the economy, and certainly distribution grows as well. So I just wanted to make that point that we're seeing almost a doubling down on automation and robotics across the board in industrial.
We had a question come in. What are your thoughts on the China plus one strategy? And one of you is going to have to explain what that is too.
Harry?
That's Harry.
China plus one, most companies source primarily from China, or many do, and solely from China. They got one supplier over there shipping the stuff in. There's some risk at that supplier, at the country, cross-specific, docks, everything. And so the thought is to have a second supplier, presumably not in China, but maybe in Mexico or India or Turkey or somewhere else. And that's certainly a valid alternative, because if you have two suppliers of the exact same product, the probability that both go down at the same time is less. Okay. On the other hand, you have two sets of tooling, two sets of drawings, two places to check on, people at each location, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have to say, is the total risk lower with one China, say one India, or just one in the United States, 10 miles from your assembly plant, and you can go in and check on them anytime. So I think the U.S. solution is probably, the one U.S. solution is certainly lower risk and probably about equally expensive.
Gotcha.
So James, if I could jump on that too, because, when it comes to risk management, the China plus one, meaning, do you continue to use China, but you add India or Vietnam or the U.S. or Mexico or Canada or whatever, it is an important way to think about sourcing or manufacturing risk mitigation. But it goes well beyond that, as you know. I mean, even though it may cost more to have an additional supplier or manufacturing location to offset the risk, it's no different than what we all do with our own personal financial portfolios. We don't put all the money into one stock. Even if that stock is a good stock and it continues to grow, it's too risky. So you have to diversify, and I think that's the key message here.
There's a follow-up question that came in from Madison. Which countries benefit from the China plus one strategy? And they mentioned Vietnam and Mexico. I also heard India. Are there others?
Well, in the initial, like a year and a half ago, about 15% of what was coming out of China was coming to the U.S. Surveys since then, I think, including the one Rich was referring to, a recent survey said 24% of companies were thinking or planning to change the location of their manufacturing, and of the 22% said the U.S. was a choice. And every survey you take comes up with different inconsistent numbers. But Mexico is the obvious place to pick a lot of it up, especially the labor intensive, because the wage rates in Mexico. I saw a chart recently that had Mexico at $4 an hour and China at 10. I think that's high for China. I think China's more like 6, but Mexico is clearly lower than China, and so you ought to be able to bring back a huge amount of what's in China. And if you can't get it in the U.S. because it's too labor intensive, get it into Mexico. One benefit for the U.S. is about 40% of the value added on the Mexican product is U.S. content. So you get sort of half a loaf when you bring it back to Mexico. So I'd say Mexico should be the biggest winner. Hasn't been for various cultural reasons, but it's in our interest to help them overcome that and make that a preferred source instead of China.
James, I think the real answer, and everybody hates this answer, is it depends. Because it really does depend on what you're making and how much labor is involved and how much can be automated. And also it depends on where it's going. So, and Harry's right when he talks about Mexico, but that assumes too that a lot of your customers are in the U.S., which has the largest, consumers population. But India is also a very good one. We didn't mention Eastern Europe as well. So, there's alternatives for sure. It just depends on, what you're making and where it's heading.
Agreed.
Gotcha. So guys, we're running out of time, but I wanted to get in. I know, Rich, you said it's tough to encapsulate these things. Sometimes you just want to say it depends, but I want to get a quick soundbite from each of you guys on what the future holds, what you're thinking about. I mean, I'm feeling very optimistic, to be frank. I feel very good about retail for the next couple of years at least. But let's just go around the circle and what's your big picture thought for what listeners and viewers should expect in the future? And Naveen, I'll start with you.
Well, you won't find a person more bullish about retail than me, James. I think the U.S. consumer has proven time and time again to be very resilient, and the U.S. consumer wants to spend money when it's given a chance to spend money. 70% of the U.S. economy is in some way or form a consumer-driven economy. We like to buy and we like to consume. When we're allowed to buy and we're allowed to consume, and we're confident in our wages and we're confident in our jobs, we spend. I think we're on the precipice of probably not just a 2-year run, James. I think we're on the precipice of between a 4 and 6 year run, where the consumer should feel far more grounded to spend his money on one of two things, either on hard goods, which it started to do back in December into the new year, or now we're seeing the dollar shifting from hard goods to services and entertainment. And I think that's likely the story that we're going to see over the next 12 to 24 months, is the consumer settling into a steady balance between hard product and service and entertainment. And that to me bodes well, quite candidly, for the next 4 to 5 years.
Harry, in your world, what are you seeing happening in the future?
Well, for perspective, the number of jobs reshored per year has gone from 6,000 in 2010 to 160,000 in 2020. So up 25 times or so. We think it'll go to 200,000 this year, maybe to 300 within a couple of years. But it's limited finally by the lack of workforce, skilled workforce especially, and it needs the government to get the dollar down, do things like that. If we're going to jack that up even further and make it so that it's easy for the retailer to see that the U.S. choice is the better choice.
So we need better educational programs as a big part of it.
The educational programs get the dollar down, keep the taxes reasonable, all that kind of thing. Yep.
Excellent. All right, Rich, bring us home. What can we expect for the future?
Well, I tell you, from a supply chain perspective, there's 3 things that I see happening, which are all positive for USA and industrial as well, which is a big part of our business. Number one is, as I mentioned, customer service expectations will continue to get more demanding. So if you expect it within 2 days for free, it's going to soon be next day, and then it's going to be within hours. And I think, that will take some time as we get there, but there's no question that it's not going to relax. It's only going to get more demanding. Okay, so that's number one, if you believe that to be true. The second is freight costs, transportation, which are the biggest operating costs for most companies from a supply chain perspective, are going to continue to go up. Despite, oil prices being relatively stable and so on, it's going to cost more and more to move product around. And so if you believe that, number 3 is sustainability. And that's something we haven't talked about on this particular discussion, but it's our point of view that, companies and governments and consumers will become more interested in sustainable companies and buying from sustainable companies. And so if you believe that, all 3 of those, sustainability, freight costs, and customer service expectations, are going to continue to go up. It means more facilities closer to your customer. You have to be nimble. And so I'm very bullish on what's happening with U.S. manufacturing and distribution, and the demand for industrial real estate's never been higher.
Excellent. Thank you all. And I know we had questions come in that we didn't have time to get to, so feel free to reach out to us via email, and we're happy to follow up with you one-on-one if we didn't get to your question. But thank you, Naveen, Harry, Rich. Fantastic to talk to you all today.
Great job, James. Enjoy it. Thank you.
For those of you who are viewing right now, I want to encourage you to subscribe. So if you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We do a live show every week. If you're on LinkedIn, follow JLL Retail on LinkedIn, and you'll see every time that we go live. And if you like listening to podcasts and you have Spotify or some kind of podcast app on your phone, search for the Where We Buy podcast and follow us or subscribe. Or if you like to stream on the web, you can go to wherewebuy.show. I just want to thank all of you for joining us today. And as always, as we say at the end of these shows, our theme music is Run in the Night by the Good Lords under Creative Commons license.
Thank you.